Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I wanted to talk about the Booker Longlist for 2025 as a whole. I've now finished reading the list, and so I have them here to talk about, well, at least 5 of them that I have physical copies of. And yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the books as a whole, any sort of themes or any things I'd noticed as things that pop up between lots of the books, and then also to choose my own personal shortlist from the 13. So let's get started talking about that. So first up, I just wanted to basically say it's an odd list in many ways. I really enjoyed overall reading these books. There are a few that I just didn't get on with quite as well. I will say on the whole though, it's an interesting mix of books. These are books that talk about a wide range of topics from a range of countries, not sort of as many as we've sometimes had, but still a fair few kind of countries and things being mentioned and spread across the books, and with quite a few books that are a little bit more offbeat or a bit more experimental. So something like, for example, Audition by Katie Kitamura, which really plays with this idea of narrative in a similar way. One Boat plays around with some of that and feels like this odd mix of fiction, non-fiction, or kind of a very dream-like book. We have something like Endling by Maria Reva, which intersperses a fictional story with the non-fiction or kind of real life aspects of Maria Reva interjecting into the text to talk about what is happening in Ukraine. And so the book plays around with this type of medium really interestingly, I think, of how you bring in various types of narrative into a book, how you can make a book play around with those things, and in many ways put the reader on the back foot, that we are looking at how a reader might have to do quite a lot of investigative work into a book to make sense of some of the aspects of it. But then it's interesting alongside that to have books that feel a lot more a lot more kind of the regular type of novel that you might expect, sometimes successfully, maybe sometimes less successfully for me personally. So for example, The Land in Winter, which I really loved, is a much more straightforward historical fiction book than some of the others on the list, but I think does so really beautifully and really powerfully in the way that it examines various things. And I will say, unfortunately, I didn't find the same with The Rest of Our Lives by Ben Markovits, which I thought was, a perfectly readable, fine book, and I did enjoy the reading process, but I kind of felt like I wanted more at the end, like I wanted it to kind of push for something deeper. And so what you get is a really odd range of books, but ones that I think do some really fascinating things. And particularly thematically, I think these books are really obsessed with history. And I know that that's a typical thing in literature. It's, throw a stone and you'll hit a fair few books that talk about history and the passing on of history. But I think these books do so interestingly, particularly how they are rooted to a sense of place. And so that's something I really loved. So I'm kind of shuffling books in the background. So for example, The Land in Winter, I think, really plays around with this idea of place by having it all really set around a small area that has to examine how it interacts with history about something that is happening far, or happened far over there, somewhere else in the past. Likewise, Seascraper, I think, is really fantastic for this, at capturing a sense of a very small area and how they are affected by the world, but also this fleetingness. There's an idea that these people are very rooted to where they're from, and that's an important thing to them. But everything else can be quite fleeting. The waves ebb and flow. Things happen in this world, and it just passes these people by. And so I think that's something quite interesting. The South by Tash Orr, I think, does something really interesting with this as well, of really examining growing up in a place, how you find yourself in somewhere. In something like Misinterpretation, we have a sense of a place following you. So even if you move to the US, your Albanianness in this book can still follow you. The tricky parts of your history can very much follow you there. And likewise with Sonia, the Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, that is a book that takes a lot this idea of how you ever leave a place. So even for an Indian woman moving to the US to study, there is a sense that that India always follows her, but that her US-ness when she goes to India is both a thing that's lauded and makes her an outcast. And so she is constantly battling through these things whilst trying to establish a relationship, and trying to just work out what she wants from life. And so I love this sense of echoing of history that appears in a lot of these books. I think it's done so interestingly, for many of them, where you have an idea that you can't fully escape something. There is always something that appears after you. In Love Forms by Claire Adam, I loved that there was an idea that your decisions you made a long time ago, even if not necessarily something you wanted to do, will follow you, and you will be always chasing some kind of connection back to something, even if that thing feels further and further away. And in Love Forms, I think it's really beautifully done in this very heartfelt way of an idea of how you bring together a family, or try to re-piece together some kind of family connection when everything else is making that maybe not happen anymore, where there's a really complicated reason for why that might not be the case. And in quite a few of these books, there's almost an auto-fictional element linked to that. So Love Forms that I just mentioned, there is a part at the end where Claire Adam writes about how in many ways it mirrors parts of her life. In Endling, we have Maria Reva actually inserting herself into the text to do so. We have in Misinterpretation, although the character herself doesn't seem to immediately reflect the author, we know that there is a strong sense of she is writing something about what she knows. She is also in New York. She is writing about Albanianness, but also in doing so is translating a thought into something in a different way. And I think there's a lot going on there that I found really quite interesting. And tied to this idea of history following you, we've got two other examples in Flesh by David Szalay, where one set of decisions that he makes as a young man, a young boy really, come on to affect every single part of his life. And in many ways, he has to shut down to respond to what is happening in his life. In Universality by Natasha Brown, the set of actions from various characters will follow them, but also they are almost trying to battle something much bigger than themselves. And in many ways, the narrator towards the media personality towards the end of Universality is this odd stand-in for what is currently happening, of a person who is able to mine the rage bait of everything around them to get what they want. And this all leads to a situation where we are forced to examine what is happening for us politically through the lens of fiction. And I think there's so much of what happens across this long list that does this, where I think there are really interesting ideas about a sort of a sweep of history, but how that really speaks to now. And again, that's a common literary trope. I'm not claiming that these books are the first to have ever done these, but I think there's something very interesting about the ways that they explore it, particularly the kind of metatextual elements that I mentioned, particularly the ways that they play with the idea of an echo of history passing down. And so this is an interesting set of books, I think. Although I will say, in some ways, I don't feel like this is the strongest long list I've read in a few years. I felt like it was only really when I was finishing reading the long list that I finally got enough books, I think, to make a shortlist that I would really be able to root for. But I say that I'm probably doing some selective thinking here, because actually in previous years there's been a bit of a case of that, where it's sometimes been the last 2 or 3 books I've read that have been my favourites, and so they've suddenly jumped into the shortlist that way. So yeah, I think there are some really interesting themes happening across this, particularly about history, particularly about meta-narratives, and particularly about how there is a strong sense of how we respond to the current moment and everything that feels like it's been going on, but maybe doing so through the eyes of something further back in history. Another example of history appearing like this is in something like Flashlight, where we see the set of characters making decisions or getting through life the only way they know how, and this showing up and having ramifications later for them, but particularly how we then recast thinking about that history, that somebody doing what they needed to do to survive in what is now North Korea could be seen in several different lenses by the characters at the time as being sort of having sucked up to the communists, but actually by a more recent and kind of current lens, maybe we're dealing with that with some more empathy, that we know that that is an incredibly tricky situation. But also looking at what South Korea and Japan are like now versus North Korea, there's something very different there about how we look at these things with an element of hindsight. And so I think that book as well deals with some very interesting ideas of how we relate to this history between two people who maybe can't understand each other because of the length of time between them, because of what has happened historically from one being born to the next being born. And in Flashlight, we see that especially with this idea of this real trauma that's passed along, of doing absolutely everything to survive, only to then watch your child potentially not actually feel that Korean after everything you've sacrificed to get them there, potentially. So yeah, lots that goes on in that book as well. So with all of that being said, here is my personal shortlist that I would love to see. I sometimes try and do predictions for what I think will actually appear. I am always entirely wrong, and I realise that my predictions are essentially my wishes anyway. And so I think I either need to really commit to trying to get inside the heads of the judges, and given this long list, I think which I didn't see coming, I doubt I'll be able to do that properly. But I think I'm going to at least give what I would like to see as my personal favourites. So my top two, I guess, that I definitely would love to see in the list, and in many ways it's sort of a top 3 or 4, but top 2 definitely would be Seascraper by Benjamin Wood. I thought this is such a phenomenal piece of writing, so heartfelt and clever, and just very good at telling a really strong story with slightly fantastical elements and slightly odd moments, but also very grounded in a place and a time, and particularly giving a sense of where this character is and how they feel that time for them is fleeting and meaningless, but also the most important thing. So yeah, I really loved this book. And my other top favourite is Flesh by David Szalay. I think there's something so powerful about the way this book looks at masculinity, and particularly how his history and sense of following through life, his sense of where he is, the decisions he makes, how he responds to things, are so impacted by everything that happened when he was a teenager, but also the kind of culture of maleness and masculinity around him, that he feels that he is almost unable to do other things. And I found really captivating as a narrator, because he is so uninterested in giving you a story, and so he will skip entire years in between 2 chapters, and he does not care about telling you that. And in some ways that is something we have to pick up, and I really appreciated that. Actually, I think there's something very clever going on there, that he has closed himself down so much that appears as his way of talking about the world. He cannot really afford to have more emotions, at least in his eyes, because emotions are things that get you into trouble. This is a book that I've gone back and forward on, but I actually think I would really love to see in the shortlist. Audition by Katie Kitamura. I know it's a divisive one. I know this has really annoyed a lot of people, but there's something really compelling about the style of this for me, where the book is completely uninterested as well in trying to make this easy for you. It spells out things across 2 different parts of the book that could in theory be 2 different timelines. One could be true, one could be false, both could be false, both could sort of be true but not really, and I really like the way the book plays with this. I think it's a real it's one that forces you to work for it, and although I know that some people have found it sort of emotionless, or kind of like it's more academic than anything else, the more I've stopped and thought about it afterwards, I kind of like what it's doing here, that it feels like it's playing with our expectations of a novel, and particularly being called Audition, it feels like we are being presented with two different parts of a play, or that we are being auditioned, or the characters in the story are being auditioned like a play. And I really loved it. I thought this was so interesting. I don't know if it's a book I'd necessarily, well, rereading it would be really interesting. I don't know if it would maybe mess with my head again to do it so soon, but really interesting book nonetheless, I think. Next up, I'd probably have The Land in Winter by Andrew Miller. I think this is a really beautifully done piece of historical fiction that is written with this real subtlety and quiet hush over it that belies really what else is going on in this novel. This is a novel that really examines post-World War II Britain in a way that is so fascinating. The ways that secrets are hidden, the ways that we think that everything is back to normal and fine, but we have people in the book dealing with the aftermath and the trauma of seeing some of the most horrific things happen. And I thought this was really exceptionally done, and a really beautiful piece of writing. And I would love to see this on the shortlist personally. And then for my last two, it's kind of between three books. And those three are The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, Endling, and Love Forms. And I've kind of gone back and forth with these quite a lot in my head. Misinterpretation is almost there as well. It's kind of between that, because I think they're all interesting in their own ways. The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny for me is probably on my personal shortlist. I found something really compelling and readable about it, and particularly the ways that it examines the intricacies of pressures on relationships. So these are relationships in the book that are often either long distance or have some complicating factor. Cultural differences are a huge part of this. External players are also a big part of this. But also really at the heart of it, the book wants to play around with the idea of narrative and how we write stories. There are passages in The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny where she talks about, where Sonia talks about writing and has people around her say, well, you can't just write about India and have it be full of mangroves and peacocks and mangoes and all these other, you know, things that feel very Indian to a kind of Orientalist eye. It needs to be something different. And in some ways, this book feels like both a response to that and two fingers up to it, because the Indian scenes in the book will lean into some of this part, but it also writes fairly unflinchingly about the US and also brings up various other parts of what comes up. So the book is in many ways a response to that in a way that I think is a lot cleverer than it initially appears. I would probably then have as my final place, I think, it's a tricky one, probably Love Forms. I really liked a lot about Endling and the way it plays around with narrative, but I think for me, Love Forms, there's something about the emotional core of the story that I found really captivating. There are some moments where, although when I started reading the book, I thought I've kind of read a similar book to this before. I feel like that it's maybe falling into the space of some tropes. I thought there was something really beautiful about the way, without spoiling anything, that the central character is really exploring what it might mean to be a mother and to meet your child. And lots of what goes into it, I thought were just so compelling and really beautifully done. And that's not to say that Misinterpretation or Endling are bad books. I really enjoyed them for different reasons. And really, I'd be happy to see those on the shortlist as well. I think they're all, yeah, I think those are fabulous books. So yeah, it's been a bit of a mixed one reading some of these overall, but that's, I think, my shortlist. And that's a shortlist I'd like to see. And yeah, I think I can see actually of the 13, there are probably about 7 or 8 books that overall I think I wouldn't be mad if they were in the shortlist. Yeah, so with that in mind, those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear yours. How are you finding reading the long list as it is? Are there any books that you would love to see in the shortlist? I'd love to hear them. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye. Quick addendum, I realised I should have said, we are expecting the shortlist on the 23rd of September. So not too long now, just under 2 weeks from when this video goes live. So yeah, we should find out very, very soon what that shortlist is. I will be away as the shortlist is announced, but I will try in the day or two after to get some kind of response to it as well. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.